He could have been anyone: an apprentice mechanic from Brisbane, a university student from Melbourne, or a young farmhand from the outback. But in the late 1960s, like thousands of others, he was handed a letter that would change his life forever. National service had called, and soon he would trade his civilian clothes for khaki greens. Before he ever set foot in Vietnam, he first had to survive Canungra, the jungle training center nestled deep in the forests of Queensland. Known unofficially among soldiers as the Land of Pain, Canungra was the Australian Army's crucible for jungle warfare, designed to break down the civilian and rebuild him as a combat-ready soldier. At Canungra, the days were long and merciless. Mornings began with forced marches through dense scrub, carrying full packs, rifles, in sweat-soaked uniforms. The terrain was unforgiving: sharp ridgelines, mosquito-infested creeks, and slippery red clay that turned every slope into a death trap. But it wasn't just the body that was tested here. The real training was psychological. Instructors, many of whom were Vietnam veterans, made it clear: if you make a noise in Vietnam, you don't get a second chance. Recruits learned how to patrol silently, to identify a tripwire in thick undergrowth, to listen for unnatural silences in the jungle. They were taught how to call in artillery, dig foxholes, react to ambushes, and survive for days with nothing but rations and water tablets. And then came the final exercise, a grueling, multi-day mission that simulated the realities of jungle warfare, complete with blank fire, flares, and surprise ambushes from the staff playing the role of Viet Cong. Most remembered it not for the physical challenge, but for the mental exhaustion, the fear of being caught, the sleep deprivation, and the constant pressure to move, think, and act without hesitation. By the end of Canungra, the man who arrived with a cheeky smile and hair gel had been stripped down, reshaped into something else. Not quite a veteran, not yet a killer, but someone on the edge of both. Someone who now moved through the bush without a sound, who could read terrain like a map, and who had learned one hard lesson. In the jungle, the quietest man lives the longest. But as the instructors often warned, this is just training. Vietnam is the real test. And soon he'd find out exactly what that meant. When his boots hit the red dirt of Phuoc Tuy province, and the smell of sweat, cordite, and monsoon rain became the only world he'd know. They told him Canungra was as close to Vietnam as you could get without actually stepping foot in a war zone. That might have been true, in theory. But nothing in Queensland, not even the hardest parts of the jungle training center, could fully prepare him for the first breath of air he took stepping off the chopper in Phuoc Tuy province. The heat wasn't just hotter, it was heavier. Wetter, like wearing a soaked wool blanket around your chest. The humidity clung to your skin, your gear, your rifle. Everything felt damp. Then came the dust, that infamous iron-red Vietnamese dust. It coated your boots, your weapon, even your food if you weren't careful. By lunchtime, it would bake into mud, and by evening it would rise again in clouds. Canungra had rough terrain, but this was a living, breathing battlefield. At Canungra, everything was controlled. You knew it was training. The instructors had blanks in their rifles. The explosions were staged, the leeches probably planted just to prove a point. But out here, the enemy didn't wear high-vis vests, the traps weren't rubber, and the silence, oh, the silence wasn't a drill. It meant danger. It meant Charlie was near. The jungle in Phuoc Tuy was alive in a different way. It wasn't just vegetation, it was a tactical nightmare. Triple canopy trees blocked light. The ground below was soft, riddled with roots, crawling with ants and snakes. Sound barely traveled, but the VC moved like ghosts. At Canungra, you practiced identifying ambush zones. Here you walked through them, praying the man ahead didn't step on a mine, or worse, that the man behind you didn't. The practical lessons kicked in fast. Digging a shell scrape before sunset became second nature. So did shaking your boots in the morning for scorpions. Navigation? It wasn't just compass and map now. It was reading broken twigs, sensing bird silence, watching how vines had been pushed aside by someone not long ago. You stopped speaking unless necessary. You learned to communicate with glances, hand signals, breath. Even the wildlife was different. In Canungra, snakes were rare. Here you saw vipers slither past gun barrels, monkeys screamed overhead, and mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Dysentery and trench foot weren't concepts. They were comrades. Most of all, the enemy was real. Canungra taught you to expect ambushes. Phuoc Tuy delivered them. Fast, brutal, sudden. 1 second you're checking a map, next you're pinned down by AK-47 fire, trying to remember where your fire support is coming from, shouting for a medic while counting your last 3 magazines. And yet, for all the shock and fear, something strange began to happen. The skills drilled into you in Canungra: move, cover, react, shoot, listen. They started to flow without thought. You were becoming what they trained you to be, a jungle soldier. But this wasn't the end of the transformation. It was only the beginning. Vietnam wasn't just a war of bullets. It was a war of heat, silence, doubt, and endurance. The jungle was quiet that morning, too quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin itch, your grip tighten on the rifle, and your heart beat like a war drum inside your chest. It had been 2 weeks since deployment into Phuoc Tuy, and the routine was beginning to set in. Move, halt, listen, patrol, dig, sleep. But nothing could prepare a soldier for that first moment when training became survival, and the enemy turned from cardboard silhouettes into real men firing real bullets. The section had been patrolling near a village suspected of harboring VC activity. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of wet earth and sweat hanging between the trees. The forward scout raised his fist. Contact imminent. Everyone dropped low, eyes searching the foliage, fingers resting on triggers. Then came the crack of an AK-47, short, sharp, unmistakable. A single shot echoed, followed by a staccato of return fire. The jungle erupted into chaos. What had been a calm patrol just seconds earlier was now a coordinated dance of fire and movement, practiced hundreds of times in Canungra, but now played out with live rounds, screaming voices, and the real possibility of death. The enemy was close, too close. They were dug in, firing from cover. One digger was hit, a bullet tearing through his thigh. The section commander radioed for support while the medic crawled low, dragging the wounded man behind a fallen tree. Meanwhile, the rest of the team laid down suppressing fire, slowly flanking the VC position. The noise was deafening. Rifles snapping, machine guns hammering, the occasional thump of a grenade launcher. The smell of cordite and blood hung in the air. You could hear the breath of the man beside you, the insects still chirping under the madness, and every so often a yell in Vietnamese from somewhere ahead. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The VC had broken contact, melting back into the jungle like ghosts. That was their way. Hit fast, hit hard, then vanish. The diggers held their ground, securing the perimeter, checking on each other. They moved slowly forward, searching the site. Blood trails, empty shell casings, a few captured documents, and a torn sandal. Small but valuable pieces of intelligence. One of the veterans turned and looked at the younger soldier, eyes wide, hands still trembling. "Well," he said grimly, "that's your welcome to Vietnam." Later, during the debrief, the young soldier realized how everything from Canungra had clicked into place, almost without thinking. The drills, the movements, the reactions, they had all worked. But there was a difference now. The abstract had become real. The stakes were not points on a scorecard. They were flesh, blood, and silence. That first contact was more than a fight. It was a transformation. From that point on, the jungle was no longer just terrain. It was a living battlefield. Every step forward would now be different. Every sound, every rustle, every decision meant life or death. And somewhere deep down, he understood. He had just become a soldier. After the adrenaline faded from that first firefight, something else set in. The long, exhausting rhythm of jungle operations. For every bullet fired in Vietnam, there were days of slow movement, tense silence, endless patrolling, and crushing discomfort. Victory wasn't always measured in enemy body count. It was measured in endurance, teamwork, and staying alive. For the young digger, the jungle now had a voice of its own. It groaned with insects, whispered with the rustle of wind in the treetops, and sometimes screamed with the shrill cry of unseen birds. Yet through all of this, the greatest danger was often silence, the kind that arrived just before an ambush or marked a booby trap buried in a quiet clearing. The lessons from Canungra had laid the foundation, But real adaptation only came in country, often the hard way. You learned fast. You had to. How to move without breaking a twig. How to tell fresh VC footprints from your own. How to read the jungle, not just as terrain, but as a living map of clues and threats. Sweat became a constant companion. Uniforms rarely dried. Feet stayed soaked for days. The leeches were relentless, silent hitchhikers that filled with blood before you even noticed them. But you stopped reacting. You had to. Flinching meant noise. Noise meant death. Every day blurred into the next. Up at dawn, patrol, observe, report, rest if you could, repeat. Sometimes you didn't see the enemy for weeks, but he was always there, watching, listening. Booby traps took more lives than bullets, and every digger knew someone who'd stepped in the wrong place at the wrong time. It taught you to walk differently, to look for things that were too perfect, too unnatural, too clean in an otherwise chaotic jungle. Yet within that hardship, something began to emerge. A quiet, almost invisible professionalism. The section started to move as one. Words were barely needed. You could tell your mate was tired just by the way he adjusted his pack. You knew how far you could push before someone snapped. You began to understand what it meant to trust someone, not just with your life, but with your silence. You also started to recognize the faces of war, the villagers you passed, the old women who looked at you without emotion, the children who smiled too easily, the young men who disappeared when the patrols came through. You couldn't always tell friend from foe, but that was part of the mental game, the psychological weight of counterinsurgency warfare. The most dangerous days weren't when you fought, but when nothing happened. Because that's when men got careless. That's when patrols started walking too loudly, or rifles weren't cleaned. And that's when the jungle struck back. Adapting to Vietnam wasn't about becoming fearless. It was about becoming quiet, sharp, patient, and utterly in tune with your team. Not heroic, just professional, just reliable, just still breathing after another day. And that was enough. By now, the jungle wasn't just terrain. It was home, mud, leeches and all. But what truly held a digger together in that green hell wasn't training or even instinct. It was mateship, an unspoken code that had traveled from Gallipoli through Kokoda and now rooted itself in the tangled undergrowth of Phuoc Tuy. In the bush, you learned quickly who you could count on. There were no uniforms for courage, no rank for loyalty, just a group of young men, many barely out of school, carrying too much weight, soaked to the bone, moving silently through a place that wanted them dead. You didn't fight for politics. You fought for the bloke next to you. You carried your mate's gear when he was too buggered to walk. You stayed awake on watch an extra hour because he needed sleep. You didn't let on when you were scared because he was too. But every now and then, you'd exchange a glance. Brief, knowing, and that was enough. No speeches, just trust, as real as your rifle. Some days that bond was tested brutally. A misstep, a sudden explosion. One second he's there, the next he's not. You dive for cover, ears ringing, dirt in your eyes. And when it's over, when the smoke clears, you crawl over to find him, hoping, always hoping. Sometimes he's okay, sometimes he's gone, but you don't leave him behind, ever. The medics, the dust-off chopper crews, the diggers who ran under fire to drag someone back, these were the quiet acts of heroism that never made it into headlines. No medals, just memory, just mateship. At night, back at the patrol base or fire base, you'd hear laughter. Real, broken, relieved laughter. Someone would brew up a tea ration. Someone else would dig out a crushed tin of biscuits. The jokes were always dark, because what else could you do? Gallows humor was a survival tool. And then, in the quiet moments, you'd see it. The smallest acts that meant the most. A digger lacing up his mate's boot because the other had a wounded hand. Someone handing over the last cigarette without a word. The corporal walking the line at midnight, checking each man, not out of duty, but out of care. These weren't soldiers from a manual. These were brothers forged in mud, sweat, and silence. Not just trained together, but changed together. Mateship wasn't taught. It was earned. One patrol, one fight, one impossible day at a time. It was what separated the Australian digger from many others. Not better, not louder, just tighter, more connected. They didn't talk about esprit de corps. They lived it, in silence, in sweat, in sacrifice. Because in the jungle you didn't survive alone. You survived with your mates. You could tell a lot about a digger by what he carried. In Vietnam, gear wasn't just gear. It was survival, adaptation, and identity. Every strap, pouch, and pocket served a purpose. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. You carried what you needed to move, fight, survive, and look after your mates. Most Australian infantry went in with the L1A1 self-loading rifle, SLR, a heavy but reliable 7.62mm weapon that packed a serious punch. Some patrols switched to the lighter American M16, especially in dense jungle, but many stuck with the SLR for its range and stopping power. The joke was, if you hit a tree, the SLR went through it. If you hit a VC, they didn't get back up. Every man carried 5 to 7 magazines, often more. Some had them taped together, jungle style, for faster reloads. Ammo weight was a constant concern, but so was having enough when contact came. Grenades were standard, fragmentation for offense, smoke for cover, and sometimes claymores for ambushes. Then came the webbing, a maze of pouches that held canteens, field dressings, bayonets, rations, insect repellent, and sometimes the last letters from home. One pouch almost always held a hexamine stove, matches in a waterproof bag, and a stash of hunger-busting Australian combat rations, hardtack biscuits, jam, tins of meat, powdered drinks, sometimes a luxury like Vegemite. But it wasn't just about weapons and food. Jungle gear evolved fast. Diggers cut their boots open to drain water faster. Some wore green towels around their necks to reduce chafing and soak up sweat. Camouflage paint came into use, along with darkened rifles and gear to break up silhouettes. The wide-brimmed slouch hat or bush hat replaced helmets in many patrols, quieter, cooler, and better for concealment. Then there were the tools of specific roles. The forward scout carried nothing shiny, kept extra silent, and often had the sharpest eyes. The section machine gunner lugged an M60, burning through belts of ammo while his mates fed it. The signaler had a heavy PRC-25 radio, a lifeline for artillery, dust-offs, or gunship support, if the batteries held. The medic, arguably the most respected man in the bush, carried his life-saving kit rolled tight and slung high. He knew every man's blood type and had to think fast when seconds counted. No one ever forgot a medic who patched them up under fire. There were also personal items. Photos from home, Lucky Charms, playing cards, sometimes a transistor radio for rare moments of calm. But luxuries faded fast. The jungle stripped things down to the essentials, and to what you could carry on your back for 5 days in 40-degree heat. Every ounce mattered. Every item had to justify its place. A man who carried too much got tired. A man who carried too little risked being caught short. Balance was everything. So you watched and learned. You adjusted. You adapted. Because in the end, what you carried wasn't just on your back. You carried your fear, your mates, your mission, your memory, and you carried it all forward, one step at a time. The jungle wasn't the only thing watching the diggers. Somewhere out there, silent, patient, was the enemy, and he knew this terrain better than anyone. The Viet Cong, or Charlie, as the soldiers called him, didn't fight by the rules many of the diggers had been trained for. There were no clear front lines, no uniforms, no open battles, just shadows, traps, and ambushes. Charlie could be a farmer in the day and a fighter by night. He vanished into the tree line before the first shot was fired, and often left behind only footprints, shell casings, or blood. For the young Australians fresh from Canungra, this was the ultimate test of everything they'd learned, and more. You couldn't rely on firepower alone. This war was about detection, about intuition, about who could outthink the other in a living maze. Sometimes contact came in the form of a booby trap, a tripwire grenade, a punji pit, or a pressure mine buried beneath soft earth. These devices weren't just deadly, they were psychological. One wrong step and it could be over. This created a new kind of fear, one that didn't scream but whispered. On patrol, your ears became your best weapon. You'd hear a bird stop singing, a faint metallic click, a distant rustle. You'd freeze, signal, spread out, wait. Every movement was a calculated risk. And when the Viet Cong struck, it was fast, coordinated, and deadly. A burst of AK-47 fire from thick foliage. Maybe a B-40 rocket whistling past your flank. Then silence again, Charlie fading into the bush, leaving behind confusion, injury, or death. You rarely saw their faces. But over time, the diggers adapted. They learned to track the tracks. They read signs, broken branches, disturbed leaves, smoke in the air. They studied the rhythm of the enemy, anticipating his movements like a hunter learning his prey. Patrols began laying ambushes of their own, claymores set in perfect silence, flanking arcs calculated down to the footstep. The Australians developed a reputation, not just as skilled infantry, but as ghosts. Their stealth, patience, and discipline made them one of the few forces the Viet Cong openly respected and feared. In fact, some enemy after-action reports specifically warned of the quiet ones, a reference to Australian SAS patrols and regular digger teams alike who moved without sound and struck without warning. Face to face, the enemy was often shockingly young. Some were teenagers, some were women. All were committed. Captured documents revealed training, orders, even praise for their cunning. But they were also human, often hungry, sometimes injured, sometimes just as scared. In the jungle, there was no glory in killing, just survival, just doing the job. It was a war of inches, not miles, of moments, not medals. And in that misty, sweltering maze called Phuoc Tuy, the diggers learned that their enemy was not just ruthless, but clever, committed, and always watching. And if they wanted to go home, they had to be better. When a digger's 12-month tour in Vietnam ended, the moment he had longed for was finally real. Rotation home. The same HMAS Sydney that brought him to war now waited to carry him back to Australia. The same flight decks, the same sea breeze. But he was not the same man. On paper, he had fulfilled his duty. He had served. He had survived. But something had changed deep inside. Beyond words, beyond uniform. War doesn't let you leave untouched. Many arrived in Vietnam as young men barely out of school. Some excited, some nervous, most naive about what waited beyond the tree line. Now they came back hardened, alert to every sound, every shadow. The jungle had taught them how to move, fight, and endure, but it had also taught them what fear feels like when it's real, and how precious a simple breath of safety could be. The return to Australia was often quiet. There were no parades, no victory flags. In fact, many diggers found their homecoming cold and confused. The war had become politically controversial. The country they fought for now wasn't sure it had wanted them to fight at all. Some were met with indifference, others with protest, and many found it easier to say nothing, to pack away their medals and memories and blend back into civilian life. But inside, the war stayed. They had memories of mates lost in rice paddies and ambushes, of the heat, the mud, the leeches, of the smell of burning cordite and the silence after gunfire, of the Vietnamese kids who smiled, of the moments of strange peace found in shared cigarettes and dark humor. These weren't the kind of stories you told easily over a beer. Back home, jobs were waiting, or sometimes not. Marriages struggled under the weight of things left unsaid. Nightmares came without warning, and sudden noises could turn a quiet street into a battlefield again. PTSD hadn't yet entered the vocabulary, but its symptoms lived in the shadows of countless veterans. And yet they went on. The same grit that carried them through Phuoc Tuy helped many rebuild. Some returned to the bush, the only place that still made sense. Others became mentors, passing down the hard-earned lessons of jungle warfare. Many simply disappeared into the fabric of society. Teachers, builders, drivers, dads, never speaking much of the man they used to be. But if you look closely, you could still see the soldier beneath the skin. You saw it in the way they scanned a room, in the way they walked with quiet purpose, in the way they looked after their mates, even decades later. From Canungra to Phuoc Tuy, the journey had forged them. What began as a training course had become a rite of passage. And while they might never wear a uniform again, they would always carry the jungle inside them. Because some wars don't end when the shooting stops. Some wars walk home with you.